Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the Pollinator Report. We're going to take a minute or so to give everyone a chance to log on. So if you're in the chat room, we'd like to see where you're streaming from this evening. I can see it on my screen and give you a shout out. Let's see, my chat is on. Do we have anyone? Oh, no one's typing in yet. Maybe give people a minute or so to, oh, hi, Faye. She's from Ohio. Thank you for joining us. We have Cheryl from Cincinnati. That's great. Mary, we got you. Oh, Mary Cha. Let's see, all panelists. We have Pam from Cincinnati, Mark from Powell, Honolulu. What? Where's that? Some of these are going pretty quickly. Teresa from Tennessee. We have Polly. She's from Michigan, Charlevoix, Michigan. Is that right, Polly? Thanks for joining us. We have Robin from Cincinnati. Oh my gosh, Tracy from Cincinnati, Neil. Oh, we have a lot of, Indiana, Kim from Indiana. Thank you for joining us. Well, I think we gave everyone a minute or so to hop on. Karen from Ohio. Thanks, Karen, for being here. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you spending your evening with us. I'd like to introduce to you now Christina Anderson from the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden.
Okay. Hannah, it's not letting. Hi. Hello, everybody. My name is Christina Anderson, and I work at the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I can't believe someone's actually on the call from Honolulu, Hawaii, but maybe that's true. That's fantastic. So thank you all. One of my jobs at the Cincinnati Zoo is managing the Plant for Pollinator program, which is it's a public engagement program that challenges everyone to increase pollinator habitats in the greater Cincinnati area. We started the program back in 2019 with a challenge of 500 gardens a year, and we're only 2 years in, and we're already at 1,700 gardens, which is so fantastic. We really can start a movement here. So I invite you today to register your garden. It's super easy, very quick, and there will be a link highlighted again at the end of the show, which you can just link onto and register your garden. You'll receive a wonderful certificate signed by Zoo Director Thane Maynard, and you can even purchase this wonderful sign to put into your garden, along with some other materials that we will provide for you. There's lots of resources on the zoo's website, including best pollinator plants for your garden that will attract pollinators. Lots of resources there, and we also have a wonderful zoo farm out at the Boyer Farm, and every month from April through to October we have a plant sale, a native plant sale, where you can find lots of great pollinator plants that you often can't find in your local garden centre. So details of that can be found on the zoo's website, and you can also contact me through our Pollination Facebook page, where there's lots of information about this and other things connected with pollinators and plants. So I encourage you to check out all these resources and come see us at the zoo. Together, we really can make a difference for our pollinator friends through the plants that we choose. And now I'd like to introduce Olivia Carril, a great zoo friend and bee expert, along with my dear friend Justina, who is the founder and owner of Osmia Bee. She's a great zoo partner and also the sponsor of this wonderful 7-part series. And her products and the zoo's mission go together so well. So thank you both. I look forward to seeing you soon. And Olivia will also be coming to Cincinnati in 2021 as part of our Barrows Lecture Series. So thank you, ladies, and great night. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, for a lovely introduction. We really appreciate you and all the hard work that you do at the Cincinnati Zoo. So thank you for a great a great introduction. Thank you to everyone who is joining us this evening. Again, I'm Justina Block. My company is Osmia Bee, and we're thrilled to be partnering with the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens. Thank you to Thane Maynard and Christina for their support. We really appreciate you. This is our third of our 7th live webinar on the Pollinator Report. If this is your first time, welcome for joining us. We really appreciate you being here. And if this is, I notice we have people that are returning for our third pollinator webinar. So thank you for being here as well. We really appreciate you. And Christina and I are streaming from Cincinnati. I'm streaming from my home in Cincinnati. Christina's actually streaming from her home in Kentucky. And Olivia, hi Olivia. She's streaming live from New Mexico. Good to see you.
Thank you. It's fun to be here. I don't know.
yeah, I know. Did you get some snow?
We did. We got snow today. We're supposed to get a little more tonight and maybe tomorrow as well. So yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for being here. You're truly a rock star in this industry, and we really appreciate you and really honored that you take the time to share your knowledge and your passion about bees. And without further ado, Olivia, taking the pulse of pollinators. Thank you.
Christina. I love doing this. It's something that I really enjoy. And so it's always fun to find an audience willing to listen. And I'm glad you all have managed to log on and join us for just a little bit of information about pollinators and what we know currently. It's a big question, and the answer is maybe not as cut and dry as I wish it was. It would make for a prettier presentation, but I'll walk you through it anyway. I got my start studying bees almost 25 years ago. 24 years ago, I guess. I was an undergrad working at Utah State University, and I managed to get a job as sort of a lackey in a lab. It was a bee museum, and I didn't realize it when I got the job, but it changed my life. It ended up being something very, very meaningful to me. Partly because I'm a collector, and so it fit with sort of who I am as a person to be working in this place where collections were what it was all about, and organizing them and getting it all set. But it also provided me opportunities to work in the field a lot, do a lot of field work, which appeals to me. I love being outside, and it gave me the challenge that I needed to become a scientist and ask questions that can be hard to answer and try and find creative ways to answer those. When I started at 18 years old studying these bees, I would go out in the field a lot, and I'd have a net, and quite often some of that early work was in national monuments, and national monuments and national parks, of course, have a lot of visitors. And so I would see people while I was wandering around collecting bees quite often, and people would often stop and ask me what I was doing, and I would explain that I was collecting bees and teach them a little bit about native bees. And the response was usually for them to tell me the story of that one time they got stung. There was a lot of, oh yeah, I know bees because they stung me. Which, you know, I've heard plenty of sting stories at this point in my life. But what's interesting to me is that over the last 25 years, even through last summer, I still go out with the net and collect bees in the summer. The question has changed, and people don't immediately respond by telling me about that one time they got stung. Instead, they ask me if our bees are going to be okay. Are our bees all right? And it means a lot to me to think that people, even having once been stung by a bee, are still willing to consider how they're doing. So that's what we're going to try and sort of dive in here tonight and answer. So are bees disappearing? Here's just a sort of a collection of images. These were all taken by my good friend and co-author, Joe Wilson. He's an amazing bee photographer. And this just represents a tiny bit of the diversity of stuff that can be found in North America and in the US. And of all of the bees that are on here, the ones that we've been able to quantify and really understand how they're doing at a level of like, well, there used to be 100 and now there's 3 or something like that, are these ones right here. Of all of those bees, these are the only ones we really know much about at all. We really are just learning even where they are. This paper came out a month ago, just a month ago. And in it, Michael Orr and some of his colleagues made a map, and finally, for the first time ever, made this beautiful map of global diversity and where in the world bees reach their highest species richness, or where the most numbers of species are. So we can see here where I live in New Mexico. This is great for me as a bee biologist. Species richness is quite high here. You can see that over here in the Mediterranean region and across and into Turkey, we get that same thing. And they describe it as, they call it bimodal. So in the areas above the equator for a region, all the way around the globe, there's an area of pretty high richness. And then on the other side of the equator, at about the same latitude, we also find an area of richness. And they talk about some of the reasons why they think they see this. But the main point that I want to make on this slide is just that here we are in 2020, and we're only just now mapping where we find these bees, let alone any of the other details about what they need or what they might be most sensitive to and affected by as the land changes. So I wanted to start by walking through a couple of studies that have been published in the last 20 years that kind of highlight what we know about bee declines, focusing on the ones that have been studied the best. I will leave the honeybee to someone who's more of an expert on that. That's not my field of expertise, but we can talk a little bit about some of these others here. So I'm going to start with the bumblebee and a really wonderful study that was done not too long ago. And it was very comprehensive, which is why I like it. And they took about 8 of the 45 bumblebee species that can be found in North America and looked to see how their ranges, or where they're found, had shifted over the last 50 years. And the way that they did that was to go back to all of these different locations and look at the records, find most of the records for these, and see if there were major changes before and after 20 years ago. And so what they found is that the relative abundance of 4 of those species had declined by up to 96%. And the geographic range where those bees were found has contracted significantly, but somewhere between 23 and 87% in the last 20 years. These declining populations, they found, had significantly higher levels of some of the pathogens that we know bumblebees don't do well with, compared to other populations where the number of individuals seem to be holding more steady. So if we look, here are the declining species. In the west, where I am, there were 2, Bombus occidentalis and Bombus terricola. And you can see where the bars are pretty different in their size. You can tell the decline is happening. And then in the east, 2 that you guys have out there, one is Bombus pennsylvanicus and the other is Bombus affinis. And there have been a couple follow-up studies since this was done that have shown the same thing at a more local scale. Looking, for example, in New Hampshire and some other places. And then we can also look at the increasing species. So there are 2 species in the West that, of the ones that they were looking at, were actually more abundant now than they were 20 years ago. And 2 species in the East that also are more abundant. So it's not so straightforward as saying all of the bumblebees are in decline or all of the bumblebees are becoming more abundant. It seems to be a mix, even within a group that seems as small and isolated as the bumblebees are. This is another, creative ways to get at the problem of how to understand whether bumblebees are in decline or not. So I'm showing you just a couple examples. Here's another one from not too many years ago again. And these guys found a different creative way to look at this. And I really like this one, because what they did is they took a data set from the 1890s. A man named Charles Robertson, who lived in Illinois, a place called Carlinville, would go out and collect bees on flowers and document extensively what bees he saw on what flowers. And those records that he took, those beautiful notes and notebooks, handwritten, just pages and pages and pages of notes, still exist. And so we can use that data to go back to the same places where he used to collect and see if there's been a major shift in what bees and flowers are out there. So they went back 120 years later. They focused on just 26 of all of the flowers that he looked at. Most of them were spring flowers. And they created this very complicated looking web. This is what we call a plant pollinator network. And on one side here are the plants. And on the other side, on the right side, in case you can't see my cursor, are the bees, the different species of bees. And the ones in red are bees that were not found anymore in his study site. And the linkages are changes in linkages. So if it's red, it was a linkage that he found that's not there anymore. Blue is new linkages, and black are ones that have remained the same over the last 120 years. So their conclusion was that so overall they found 109 species, but of the linkages, of the little lines that are connecting everything together, only about a quarter of the original linkages persisted, which sounds really dramatic and maybe a little scary. 407 of the 532 interactions from those 120 years ago were not found. They are not there anymore. And not a single one was because the plant is gone. The plants are still there. Instead, it was because they didn't find bees on those flowers. And it's important to note here that what they're saying is not that the bee, so by doing it in this way, one of the drawbacks is that they can't say that the bee didn't exist in the area. All they can say is that it didn't occur on those 26 plants. So some possibilities for some of these bees are in the case of a bee that's sort of a generalist and will visit any kind of plant species when gathering pollen to feed to its offspring. It could be that there's an invasive plant that's in the area that wasn't there 120 years ago that those generalist bees find more attractive. And so they're more commonly found on those. Or alternatively, when you zoom in and look at this, if you're a bee nerd like me, you notice interesting little things like the number of kleptoparasites that were recorded 120 years ago by Robertson that weren't recorded more recently. And my conclusion with this is that those bees are probably still in the area, because when you look through the tree, the plant phenology, the bees on which those kleptoparasites rely are still there. So chances are good, but a kleptoparasite is a bee that sneaks in, kind of like a cuckoo bird. It sneaks into the nest of a normal host bee and lays an egg sort of behind the pollen that she's gathered for her own offspring, and then sneaks back out. And that bee, when it hatches, actually eats the pollen that was meant for a different offspring, for the host bee's babies instead. And so they don't collect pollen. They don't really have a close relationship with any of the flowers. So if they're not found on these same plants, maybe that's because they're on something else and it really doesn't matter. Anyway, so we get what we can from this. We glean the information that we can, but the other part of this is that we don't really know how much sampling effort he put in. So it's really hard to exactly duplicate his efforts. So it gives us a hint at what's going on without actually giving us the full answer that we really wish we could have. This is another lovely paper that came out about 8 years ago. And these gals, a whole bunch of people all together, made a list of all of the bee species that had been found in the East. And they found 770 different kinds of bees that were there. And they looked to see if those bees were still persisting in the area. And they found that 95% of the bees present prior to 1990 were still there. Of course, this is presence absence. It doesn't tell us whether they were increasing or decreasing in abundance. It just tells us that they're still in those areas. And this is a pretty robust study. They looked at millions of records to kind of pull this together, which is pretty amazing. And the ones that weren't there, the species that weren't there, were rare before 1990, and many of them were sort of at the edge of their range. So maybe those bees kind of flit in and out depending on whether it's a good year or not a good year, or whether the climate's doing something interesting. So in sum, we can say that some species of bombus do appear to be declining significantly. A few are also becoming more abundant, which is interesting. Bee communities are changing for sure, and floral visitation patterns have definitely changed over the last 100 years. How significant this is, we can't really say for sure. And we don't have much in the way of quantitative data on bee populations. If we don't know how many individuals were there 50 years ago, it's really hard to see a number now and know if that's more or less than was there in the past. So what do we do with all of this? What do we do about this? Well, we need more data. And how are we going to get that? And how can we be creative in coming up with ways to sort of study this? We can maybe use some genetic studies to figure out whether genetic diversity, the gene pool, is increasing or decreasing, and maybe that can tell us something about how big or small a population has gotten. Is there something we can learn from those bee museums like the one that I used to work in that maybe could tell us something? Could we look at pollen on bee legs to see how they've shifted over the last 20 or 30 years in terms of what they're visiting by looking at those older records? Are there new methods we could use, new statistical methods for analyzing data that prior to now seemed impossible to pull anything useful from? Can we combine efforts? We have federal land, the Forest Service and the BLM and Fish and Wildlife and all of these different places who maybe have spent a little time studying some of these bees for some other project or larger insects. Can we pull from those and states and universities and other scientists and a variety of programs and things to figure out what's really going on with bees? Maybe there's more data already out there that we haven't looked at. Is there a way to involve people like you, people who really love bees and would love a chance to kind of dive into some of this and really find out what's going on with bees? Or can we pick just like one bee and use that one bee to tell us something meaningful about all of the other bees? My guess is no, considering that even within the bumblebees, there seems to be some variation, but maybe, is there some group of bees, specialists maybe more than generalists, or cavity nesters instead of ground nesters, or something that could kind of hint to us what's going on with a larger bee population? And then finally, are there ways that we can start now and quantify bee populations over time by doing it in a standardized way, so that if someone comes back in 120 years, we don't have to guess at how much effort was put into collecting on a particular place. Instead, we can go back and repeat the same methodology that was used by someone else. So this is the part that I do. I spend all of my summers out trying to quantify bee populations. That's where my passion and my interest and my expertise at this point kind of lies, is in taking my net and going out and swinging madly on every plant that I can, anywhere that I can, and hoping to learn something about the bees in that area. I try and do it in a way that is methodical, so that I can repeat my efforts the next year and really say one way or another whether bee populations are increasing or decreasing. And I even try and counter for the bias that I might have in collecting one certain kind of bee over another by using multiple collecting techniques. So in addition to the nets, one of the things that I use a lot is, can you see these little, I'm holding a little yellow thing in my hand. It's a tiny, what are they, solo cups that you might get at a picnic in the summer, and they're spray painted colors that seem to be very attractive to bees. And so I put a little bit of soapy water in there and I leave them out, and it results in still a biased collection. If a bee doesn't like yellow or blue or a pan trap in general, they're not going to go, but it can counter some of what I have for my net collections as well. So I'm going to briefly go over a few of the studies that I've participated in the past to try and answer these questions, and a little bit of what I've learned, and then some of the projects that I'm working on right now as well. So I got my start, my first real field project, which was so much fun, was in Pinnacles National Monument. I was maybe 19 when I started. 19 or 20, somewhere in there. And I got to camp the whole time I was out there. I lived in a tent for like 3.5 months, which was so fun. I got to wander around and look at flowers all day as a job. That was my job, was to look at flowers and collect bees on them and document what I was seeing. The cool part about this is that after I finished my work and went on to do other things, some other people came behind me, other graduate students working for the same bee museum, the same bee lab that I had gotten my start in, and repeated my study and looked for differences over the last 10, 11, 12 years since when I had been there, which is really neat. So I didn't put standardized plots up in this place. I don't know how many of you have been to California, but the place where I was is what we call chaparral. And chaparral is this dense, very thick, shrubby region that is impossible to walk through. So you have to walk on trails to really get very far for most of the area. And so for that reason, I collected along lengths of trails and used that as my sample, sort of a transect really in that sense. And from 1996 to 1999, we found almost 400 species in this very small area. Pinnacles National Monument at that time was 5 miles by 5 miles square. So 25 square miles. We found 400 different bee species, and those were in 52 different genera. When we add in the stuff that was done in 2010 through 2012, that number goes up to 450 bee species, and a new genus was found that I didn't find when I was there. The monument grew in size, a little extra piece was added, and it's possible that some of those new species came from just that small addition that was added between 1999 and 2010. So here's the data. I'll just show you a little bit of data because it's fun. Numbers are fun. And this shows how the bee population changed. So here I am out with my net, and let's say I catch 10 bees, and we can label them A through H. Isn't that 10 in the alphabet? A through H. If I go back the next year and also catch 10 bees, how many of the original A through H do I find, and how many are new, I, J, K, L, M, N, bees that I didn't get that first year? So we can take that sort of information and turn it into a nice, neat number that ranges from 0 to 1, with 0 being nothing in common, totally dissimilar, and 1 being completely similar. Let me go back. There we go. So the closer the number is to 1, the more similar the bee species that were collected are to the collection before. So since I started in 1996, we couldn't compare 1996 to 1996. But the next year, what I find interesting is how far from 1 this is. Yes, there were some similarities, but there's also quite a bit of difference here. 0.68 is a little lower than I would have thought. And you can see that that's a trend that holds true no matter what year. So 1996 compared all the way up to 2012, we're still seeing the same amount of difference from year to year, which suggests to me that bee populations very naturally tend to vary from year to year in terms of who the dominant players are. And this seems to be something that holds true no matter which 2 years you look at. They're always, they could be more similar to each other. In terms of the genera, so this is genus level, sort of like a mason bee would be Osmia. The blueberry bee is Habropoda, that's the genus level. And they're quite similar. We're finding the same genera, we're just finding different species within them each of the years. So after I finished that and got my feet wet and kind of had a taste for collecting bees, I rather ambitiously embarked on a project for my master's, studying the bees of a place that's in south central Utah, almost to the Arizona border, called Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. And I spent 4 seasons there. A season there runs from April through October. So I spent a 6-month period for 4 consecutive years collecting bees in this place. And I should point out that this monument is 2 million acres in size. It's huge. It's very, very big. If you were to drive it from top to bottom, it's about 50 miles, and from east to west, it's about 100. So really, really big area. I collected just with nets. I didn't put out pan traps, and I'm glad I didn't, because we have plenty of bees just from collecting with the nets, and I have great floral records that I can look at. I set up 48 plots that were what we call standardized. So when I visited, I collected in the same area. It was 1 hectare in size, 100 meters by 100 meters. And I collected it in the same way for the same amount of time every 2 weeks for the duration of the field season. So I had 48 of these, and I just rotate through. And on the way driving to them, we'd stop and collect opportunistically to just see what other bees we could find on plants that didn't show up in our plots. So we did this bi-weekly from April through October for 4 years, and we ended up with a pretty nice data set that we can look at. And the great part is we can now go back to those same plots and look and see if there are any changes. I had 8 field assistants a year because truly the area is the size of Delaware. It's huge to try and collect these tiny, tiny little bees. The areas that you see in orange here are places where we stopped. You can see there's this area here where we didn't do any collecting. I don't know if you guys have heard of, I always forget his name. I think it's Bear Grylls, the man who would like go out and try and live in the wild and stuff. This is one of the few places in the world where he called it quits and gave up and didn't make it through. This is pretty remote and really hard to get to. And so there are some empty spaces, and I do wonder what bees are in there that we didn't get, even with all of that collecting. The yellow places are where my plots were, the ones that I collected in that standardized way. So over those 4 years, we collected a total of 80,000 individuals. This sounds like a lot, doesn't it? 80,000 little bees. If we're thinking bees are in decline, that seems kind of crazy. But when you take 80,000 individuals and divide it by 4 years, that's 20,000 bees a year. And then you take those 20,000 bees and divide it by 2 million acres. And we're looking at about 1 bee for every 100 acres per 4 years. So it's actually a pretty small number. We probably could have sampled even more and learned more. I think there's still more information out there. It was a total of about 3 years worth of collecting every day, so 1,632 days. And we caught quite a few of the species that were found in the monument as a whole inside those plots, so that's really cool. And what I think is really neat is we found them on so many different flowering plants. These bees are visiting everything and are probably really integral to the pollination of most of the plants that you see in that desert region. Some of them were more popular than others. So 17 of these plants hosted 75% of all of the bee specimens that I caught. Notice how many of them are yellow. Yellow fall composites are a really big deal in that part of the world. And then there's some invasive plants on here too. So some of the invasive bees are also very, very important to bees. So here's the part that I find really interesting. Now that you know about the flowers and the bees' relationship to them, look at this. So this is looking here at this is my version of a plant pollinator network. So we're just looking at 3 of the 4 years of data that I have, 2001, 2002, and 2003. And this is the bi-weekly time period that I collected. So here's early May, early June, late June, early July, late July, etc. The part in blue is a plant. And the orange is the bees that were visiting it. And what I want you to notice is that the relationships of bees and plants change from year to year. Which plants were the most popular with the bees changes a lot each year. So for example, this one right here, this is Mellilotus, it's a sweet clover. And this plant right here is this one up here. And you'll notice there's not many bees on it that year, but then it's a little more popular there. So this seems to be rather something that I think happens naturally in a lot of these ecosystems is this constant shifting from year to year, not only in which bees are there, but also in how they're relating to the plants that are in the area. And so if that's the case, it makes me wonder whether in the case of Robertson's data, what we're seeing, maybe part of that is natural variation that occurs. And again, here we are stuck not knowing the answer to what's going on with our bees. The other thing that I found that's kind of neat is that the bees were highly localized. Where I found them, they were very abundant, but I might only find them in a couple places. And then in other places, I would find different species dominating. So rather variable across the landscape, which makes me wonder how much area do you have to sample in order to really understand a bee population, considering that each place has a slightly different bee fauna. And then finally, and this is really cool, last year we got to go back, and it was only for a 1-week period, but we went back and looked at 12 of those 48 plots for a 1-week period to see what we could learn about the bees in those places and how they'd changed in the last 20 years. And we found that the bee population in terms of species richness hasn't changed a whole lot, but who is in that community has shifted a little bit, which is kind of fascinating. Maybe bee variability and these natural shifts are part of the discussion of how to monitor and understand what's happening to our tiny little bees. So, and that brings us to what I'm doing now. I live in New Mexico, which is a rather understudied state as far as bees, which makes my work really rewarding. That also happens to be where I live, so that makes it easy to drive to my field sites. Over the last 4 years, I've done bee surveys in 3 different national monuments, and then also a private ranch and some Forest Service land, kind of trying to document what bees are here, what plants are important to them, and also looking at how some of the landscape level treatments here might be affecting bee populations. So for example, what does grazing do to bee populations? So looking at areas that are grazed and ungrazed, or how does a burn change bee species richness? And then starting this next year, I'm adding onto that a whole bunch of field sites. These are all locations of rare and endangered plants in New Mexico. And we want to figure out what role bees play in pollinating them, whether they're important. And if so, what sort of habitat requirements do they have that we might need to consider when trying to figure out how to take care of these little guys. So after all of that, after 20 some odd years of looking at these bees, I can see that in my research, I haven't seen any crazy alarm bells. I haven't seen any bee that just used to be really common and so much isn't there anymore. Granted, my longest study is 4 years in a place, which in terms of bee research is a fairly long study, but still in those 4 years, I didn't watch anything decline too significantly. There was one year where there was a major frost event on one of my high elevation sites. The frost came late and at a time when a lot of the queen bumblebees were just getting started and just out foraging. And we did see a drop in them for a couple years, which is kind of interesting. But I don't think it was so much because the bumblebees were in decline there, in that that the queens had to rebound after that event happening at such an unfortunate time. So that's in my studies, which is very small and very limited bit. But what about in the literature? Even though we don't have the data to sort of quantify some of these bee declines that we think might be happening, do we know enough about bees' needs to be able to do some sort of cause and effect studies and see whether some of the things that should affect bees actually are? And the answer is yes. So for example, pesticides. In agricultural areas, we are getting more and more information that suggests that in fact they may be detrimental. Maybe not the same way for all of the different species, but many of the bees appear to be affected by pesticides. Of course, this will be a stronger effect in areas with a lot of agriculture and maybe not so much in desert regions where it's hard to grow anything. Habitat fragmentation appears to really alter bee communities and may be an important consideration, and something that's pretty easy to combat with very simple things like planting gardens in cities to kind of help diminish some of the effects of habitat fragmentation. And finally, climate change seems to be causing some asynchrony, so some timing issues in terms of bees and their flowers, especially at high elevations. But how widespread this is and which of the bees it's affecting, we are still trying to figure out about that answer. So the end of all of this, my grand conclusion is going to be so dissatisfying to you all. The status of North America's best pollinators is to be determined. To me, this is a hopeful thing. This isn't something that you should feel too terrible about. Rather than saying that all of our bees are in decline, this gives us reason to hope that maybe some of them aren't doing so bad. Maybe we know enough to at least say that certain bees are going to be winners and maybe are doing a little better, whereas other bees, maybe are losers. And that's, if we know that, if we know which bees those are, that's where we can focus our efforts and most try and help them. So I'm going to quit right there. I'm going to leave this slide up for just a minute here. And on this slide, I have put contact information. If you want to reach out to me after this is over, if you have a special question you'd like to ask, or you think of it after this is over, feel free to reach out to me or to Joe. Joe checks on our social media stuff a lot, and he might be able to also help you with that. I'm going to keep sharing my screen, but I would love to take any questions you have. So I'm going to look here and see what we might have. How can I start studying bees in my own backyard? Edith says, and any of you that have questions, now would be a great time. Feel free to stick them there in the question and answer or in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I think a great way to start studying bees in your backyard is with a cup of coffee or tea. Wait till a lovely spring morning when whatever plants you happen to have around you are finally blooming, and go out and just stand there and look, because chances are good you actually have bees in your backyard right now that you're not aware are there. So step one is learning to see them. It's important to learn to see those bees. And after you're very aware of what they are, then it's time to start doing some research and learning who they are. And maybe you can even do some of the fun things that people do where they document the phenology, which is how they change across the season. So in March, when I was out, I saw X, Y, and Z. But when I went out in May, I saw these totally different bees on the same flowers. And it's kind of fun to watch that seasonal shift and get to know intimately the bees that you have there. It seems like shameless self-promotion, but I would recommend a book of a book of some kind. There's several pretty good guides out there right now. This is the one that Joe and I wrote, so it's the one that I have on hand, but there are other ones if some other style is your preference. But something like this with lots of really big pictures and nice text might be helpful to figure out what you have. And what's fun about big pictures is you can flip through and be like, wait, that's it. That's the one that I saw. And you don't really have to know much to get started if you have those nice big pictures. So Edith, I would say start with something like that. Start with watching them, start with reading a little bit. And then if you're really into it, Justina a little later on is going to talk about some other ways that you can encourage those bees to come to your yard. And so that's also a really good option, just kind of promote the bees and bring more to your yard. Polly asked, do you think, go ahead, Justina, did you?
I was gonna, Polly, go right ahead, Polly.
Okay. Do you think that bee species richness in desert area is because there's less overlap with people? I don't think that's what it is, because even in areas of like the Amazon rainforest where there aren't any people, there's also no bees. I think it has more to do with the habitat preferences of the bees. And in fact, that paper that I showed a little bit earlier on, the one that just came out that had the nice map, they actually mapped forested areas onto that and found that in areas with a lot of overstory, anywhere in the world, there's just not as many bees. So they kind of correlated those two and suggested that might be part of what drives bee species richness. I would agree. And I think there's more to it than that. One of the things that I've found is that in areas where we have a lot of really rich, amazing forests, you also seem to have wetter soils. And I do wonder if with all of our ground nesting bees, those wet soils don't end up being a bit of a problem for successful nesting and becoming super abundant. So that I think it's more to do with the habitat preferences than with the people that are there. Phoenix is a giant city, for example, in the desert.
Here's Lewis. I no longer treat my lawn, which is now full of weeds, but those weeds attract bees, and I've never had more bees before. That's great. What can we do to attract more bees to our yards? That's from Lewis.
Nice, Lewis. Great question. Yes, and it's true. And weeds are in the eye of the beholder, right? Well, unless you live in a homeowners association where they really frown upon weeds, and then you might have a problem. But generally speaking, bees, especially the generalist bees, will visit any plant that seems to be abundant and has good nectar and at least semi decent quality pollen in it. And what's interesting is that quite often the plants that are successful as weeds are successful because they're very attractive to pollinators. So there's definitely a reciprocal thing going on there. In terms of attracting more bees to your yard, I encourage natives, not just not to replace the weeds so much. The weeds are probably going to be there as long as you're not spraying, but because the natives will bring in some of the specialist bees that you probably have in your area, whereas the weeds maybe won't. And so that can increase the number of bees that are in your area, increase the amount of area that's in flower or the flowering season. So if right now you have a nice patch of summery things, think about some trees that bloom in the early spring, or maybe some fall composites. And then again, I keep hinting at this, Justina can talk to you about other ways to add nesting habitat to your yard as well. I recommend that people stay away from some of that mulch and stuff. I find some bees seem to have a hard time getting through it, especially the mulches that are like dyed different colors. I don't know that that goes over well all the time with bees.
We have another question. That was a great question. Teresa, do you see many invasive species in the wetland studies versus seeing them in urban surveys? Do you think invasive species are contributing to any displacement of any certain species?
Great question, Teresa. I find some invasive species in my wildland studies, but not as many as I see reported in urban studies. And to be fair, I've never done an urban study myself, so I'm only going off of what's been reported. But generally speaking, some of those invasive species seem to follow humans in a sense. They seem to have gotten here because of human activity in the first place and seem to do well in cities. And do they contribute to displacement of any species? I know this from reading. I haven't seen this and witnessed it myself, but I have read that there is sometimes competition for nest holes and even some aggression between, for example, some of the native wool carder bees and the invasive Anthidium manicotum, the European wool carder bee that's here. So yes, I think that they can contribute to displacing certain species. Now, how widespread that is, how much of an issue, probably depends somewhat on whether the nesting resources are a limiting factor to begin with. But yeah, it's definitely, I think, in cities especially, an issue.
Do you see any other questions?
Let's see here. I've read anecdotal stories about bee intelligence, that bumblebees recognize human faces, they dance in formation, etc. We saw a report this week that honeybees placed chicken feces around the perimeter of their nest to ward off the invasive Asian bees. Yeah, so most of the things that are typically associated with intelligence from a human point of view are associated with the honeybee. They definitely do those dances, but we know that like social wasps, social insects in general, I think get associated with intelligence as humans tend to measure it. Wasps also can recognize faces. Bumblebees can solve simple problems in order to get at rewards and things like that. So I think, yes, there is some intelligence there that is worth celebrating and remembering. Honeybees aren't the only ones that use feces in any way. There are bees that nest in animal dung, for example. And there are bees, one of them, a really cute little one called Diadasia. It's a mallow specialist that actually also lines its nest with little pieces of feces, although it appears to be their own feces that they're using around it. But yeah, there's so much still to know about bees that we don't have a clue about just yet.
Should we take one more, or
yeah, let's do one more here. Let's see.
which one would you like?
Let's see. To continue to educate. How does fire season impact bees? That's a great question. Let's save that. I see 2 fire questions, so let's come back to those at the end. I see one here that says, are there certain native plants that are better to attract osmia bees? Yeah, and if you look, well, it depends on the osmia. So there are some osmia that are generalists and will go to pretty much anything that you plant. Maybe one of the best ways to encourage osmia is to provide them with nesting habitat, especially, and I don't know where you are, but if you happen to be in the East, you might have some success. And Justina, do you want to talk a little bit about the success that you've had with osmia?
I would love to. Yes, I would love to.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you. Those are some great questions. Again, I'm Justina Block. I started my little bee company about 3 years ago. I've been raising solitary bees for 11 years now. And everyone could help the bees. Between Osmia Bee and you can make a huge impact for the bees in your backyard. Next slide. Probably most of you know this already. We have over 4,000 bees in North America, and we have 500 different species right here in Ohio where I live. So we have quite a few native bees here in Ohio that need your help, and you can provide for them. Our next question. So I do sell bee raising kits, and out of the over 3,000 native bees, my kit comes with 2 different bees. So I'll discuss the 2 bees that come with my kit. It's Osmia lignaria. This is a spring mason bee. And mason bees are known to pack a punch when it comes to pollination. They're 100 times more effective than a honeybee. And a lot of people ask me, well, what's the difference between solitary bees and honeybees? Well, mason bees are a solitary bee. They do not live in a hive like honeybees do. They have a shorter distance of flight. They have a radius about 300 feet, which is about the length of a football field, what makes them ideal for backyard gardeners and hobbyists. And then next slide. So really, this is how you can really make a difference in 4 easy steps. Create a pollination space, like Dr. Olivia suggested. And we all say, if you could only do one thing for your pollinators, create a pollination space, even if it's in a pot, and create, corridors, as we have other pollinators that are migrators. So this is a great way to support all kinds of butterflies and hummingbirds, as well as the pollinators in your yard. So we figure if we had 600 of our little mason bee houses, we have this little house here, this is our newest little mason bee house. So if we had 600 of these, and talking about the mason bee, your spring mason bee, Osmia lignaria, is, or another name they call it is the blue orchard mason bee. It, in her life cycle, she can lay anywhere from 18 to 20 new bees. So if we had 600 houses out there, just to give you some numbers, we'd have increased the bee population by 12,000 bees in your first season and over 240,000 bees in the second season. So this is a great opportunity for people to actually help increase the native bee population right in their backyard. These are some of the bees. I live in a neighborhood called Hyde Park in Cincinnati. So along with the bees that I release, which is the Osmia lignaria, these are other Osmia. We have about 140 different species of Osmia in North America. And here are some of the most beautiful bees that nest in my reeds. They're wild. Of course, all the bees are wild, even the ones that come with their kit. These are wild bees. These are not propagated in a cage or anything. So this is a great way to learn about other bees. And of course, I always have my handy dandy book to recognize them. All these bees were identified by Dr. Terry Griswold from the USDA Bee Lab. So thank you, Dr. Griswold, for identifying these bees. And then our kit also comes with a summer leafcutter bee. There's about 240 different species of leafcutter bees. So you may see a variety of different leafcutters other than the ones that come with your bee raising kit. And you can see in your far right corner of the screen, you can see where it's a very different cocoon. They use leaves, a very soft leaf, to create a cocoon. And then the mason bees, you can tell that they use mud for their nesting materials. So going back to our new bee house here, our other bee houses are made out of cedar, but this house is made out of rice husk. It's very light, it's waterproof. It's a great way to support your native bees. We also will be sending our bees in our new release tube, which your bees will come in here. You just remove the top, and a great way to release your bees. So here are some of the other bees. For more information how to raise native bees in your backyard, please visit us at osmiabee.com. And we're back to Olivia. And Olivia, if you could talk a little bit about your book, and I think Olivia has a new book. And I also would like to mention that Olivia will post on Osmia Bee, social media, Instagram, and Facebook for Science Saturday. Everybody, we get great comments for Science Saturday. Olivia always posts an interesting fact about bees. You will also find Olivia on social media at the Cincinnati Zoo on their Instagram and Facebook as well. So please look up Olivia's postings on Saturday, sometimes Saturday you'll so it's a treat to keep looking. You'll see other postings as well. So thank you, Olivia, for doing that. Thank you.
I struggle with the fact that I'm 2 hours behind you. So when I give it at noon, it's always like late afternoon for you. So yeah.
No, I don't even know what she's going to post. So first thing I start doing is looking at my Instagram. And I'm like, oh, she hasn't posted yet. And so you're right. I don't know when you're posting, but I'm constantly checking because it's a lot of fun. No, I do. And I always learn something new. So thank you for doing that, and sharing your information with the zoo as well. So thank you so much. And but we'd like to hear a little more about your book, and you have a new book coming out.
Yeah, so the one we have now, someone was so kind to say that they read it once and they're reading it again. Thank you. I'm glad to hear it's been useful to you. Joe and I wrote it for kind of different reasons. I was just coming off of getting my PhD, and I'd spent the last five years or whatever it was, 6, I don't remember. While I was working on my PhD, I was in a plant biology program, and there were a lot of people who wanted to study plants. And part of studying a plant often involves studying also the pollinators of that plant. And it was disheartening to see how many master's and PhD students had to, as their final slide in their master's defense or whatever, stand up there with a slide that said, big bee, small bee, bumblebee, and honeybee. And that was as far as they could get with bee identification, because there was no good guide to get people started. There's some really good information out there, but you have to have a little bit of a background in bees to get into that. And so my goal was to try and help some of those people who were beginning master's and PhD students. Joe, meanwhile, was a professor. He'd been at Utah State for a couple of years. He skipped the whole master's thing, so got a little bit ahead of me there. And he'd been invited to talk to a lot of different groups, and it seemed that there was this growing interest from naturalists who had been into birds and then into butterflies to learn a little more about these bees. And so between the two of us, we came up with this idea to write this book that kind of goes over the different genera and the natural history of the species, or the genera that you can find in North America. And after we published it, Princeton reached out to us and asked if we might be interested in doing 2 follow-up books, the first of which will come out sometime in the beginning of this next year, hopefully May or June or somewhere in there. And it's more of a species level guide, so it'll focus on bee ID at a deeper level. So if you want to know what species you have, if it's something that's fairly distinctive, we tried to include it in here. And of course, there's many that you can't tell apart without years of experience and a little luck and a good microscope. And so those ones we kind of avoided, but just to sort of dabble for people that wanted to get to the species level and take sort of a deeper dive, we wrote this second book. So that'll be coming out soon if that's your cup of tea. Something maybe to look for from Princeton University Press sometime in the next 6 months, they tell us. So that'll be exciting.
That is exciting.
There's 2 things here, Justina, really quick. Someone asked if they need to replace their mason bee homes and nests each year. Can you answer that question for someone?
Well, we'd like you to replace the natural grass reeds. That would be something to replace, because our 4th, we have 4 steps. The 4th one is to actually harvest. So you actually would want to crack this open and open it up, and inside is where you will see your mason bee cocoons or leafcutter cocoons. And sometimes you see grass wasps, which we love. We just leave those alone. We just leave them in the house. You could actually tell from here. But again, visit us at osmobee.com. We actually had a video that will show you how to harvest your cocoons. So yes, you can buy your replacement reeds for next year, so your bees have a clean new reed to nest in.
Great,
so
thanks.
It's a great way to support them and increase. Yeah, it's a lot of fun when you get started. It's addictive. But I'd also like to thank a few of our people that other sponsors too. Also, don't forget to the Pollinator Challenge is a great gift. People are thinking, what can I use as a stocking stuffer or under a tree? Register a friend's garden for them, and have a sign, could be shipped to you, that they can put in a stocking, which is a lot of fun. It's a great little sign. And I'd like to thank Kroger's Simple Truth, of course, the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden, and Christina Anderson at Pollination, the Pollinator Challenge. Some of our other supporters is a shout out to Ron Wilson in the Garden 55 KRC. Thank you, Ron. You've been great. He's supported all our 7 webinars, so he's wonderful. And thanks to Bee Haven. We really appreciate you. It's the Beads Needs. Oh, I love that. Their logo. Thank you so much, Sam, for your support. And at White Oak, thank you, Jeff. White Oak Nurseries. They're huge. You'll find a huge selection of pollinator-friendly plants and great experts to help you with that. And Brett Gilmore at Wild Birds Unlimited. Thank you so much for all your support. We couldn't do this without everyone helping. It's been very exciting. And thank you, Olivia, for coming back. You'll be
always a pleasure. Always. I think we didn't get to just a couple of questions. So if people are interested in answers to those, go to Bees in Your Backyard in the next couple of days. Joe and I can put answers to the questions about fire. I'm sure there are other people in the country who'd like an answer to that one. So we'll post what we know about that one. And if I did see a bee decline, someone asked, and I'll just say briefly that as a scientist, the best thing that I can do is share that knowledge, not necessarily with educating people about bees and natural history, but by saying to everybody, hey, look what I found. I found this bee that's in decline, and then let policy take it from there and try and do something to help. So that would be an answer to that one. And I'll answer the fire one on our social media. So tune in and check that out and see what you can learn there.
That'll be
Thanks,
great.
Christina. This has been so fun.
Well, thank you. It's really a pleasure and such an honor to have you. You're amazing. Thank you so much. And thank everyone for joining us. And we really appreciate your support. And again, we couldn't have these webinars without you as well. So we appreciate you. Have a wonderful, safe holiday and a great new year. We'll see you back next month with Olivia. We also have a guest speaker, Dr. Dino Martins from Kenya, with the Burroughs Lecture Series with the Cincinnati Zoo in February, which will be announced. So we have some, and we also have Dr. Teresa Pittsinger. She'll be discussing mason bees in orchard pollination. So it's a great presentation and another avenue how solitary bees or native bees are being used to help pollinate our crops. So thank you to everyone. I really appreciate you. Thank you again, Christina. And thank you, Thane Maynard, and everyone at Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens. Until then, have a safe and great holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you.